quando è venuta fuori la notizia che Steve Reich stava scrivendo un pezzo per la London Sinfonietta con la musica dei Radioheads, allora subito si è cominciato a dire ecco, adesso a Steve Reich piace la musica dei Radioheads. In realtà questo non c'entra assolutamente niente con il pezzo che avete sentito, nel senso che non è esattamente così che è andata la faccenda. La faccenda è andata in quest'altra maniera. Steve Reich stava scrivendo un pezzo per la London Sinfonietta che però non funzionava, era un pezzo che l'avevano provato a Londra ma era troppo caotico, era un complesso contrappunto di 15 strumenti con altri strumenti preregistrati, insomma non funzionava. Nel frattempo lui è andato a Cracovia dove c'era un festival dove era stato invitato. In questo festival il chitarrista dei Radioheads, che si chiama Johnny Greenwood, ha interpretato una delle composizioni più note di Steve Reich, vale a dire Electric Counterpoint, che è un pezzo per chitarra elettrica. Per meglio dire, c'è una chitarra elettrica che suona dal vivo una traccia, che suona dal vivo una parte, e contro questa parte suonata dal vivo c'è una cosa preregistrata con 10 parti di chitarra elettrica e 2 parti di basso elettrico preregistrato. Questa esecuzione di Johnny Greenwood è piaciuta molto a Steve Reich e si sono conosciuti, lui ha apprezzato quello che faceva, allora gli è venuto in mente di conoscere meglio la musica dei Radioheads. Allora è andato a cercare su internet le canzoni dei Radioheads, ne ha trovate un paio, una che si intitola Everything in its Right Place e l'altra che si intitola Jigsaw Falling into Place. Ha preso questi due materiali musicali, li ha elaborati, sviluppati e li ha fatti diventare questa composizione che usa strumenti che non sono gli strumenti di una rock band, ma sono strumenti appunto della tradizione, cioè della London Sinfonietta, che è un'orchestra che suona con gli strumenti della tradizione classica. Quindi lui ha fatto un lavoro come dire, di riutilizzo dei materiali, che è una cosa che si faceva fin dai tempi di Bach. Giusto, Steve Reich? Lei ha cercato di fare qualche cosa che fa parte di una tradizione molto più antica.
Oh my gosh, I'm so loud in my earphones. Maybe you can turn me down. Maybe I'll take them off for a moment. I think that we sometimes lose sight of the reality that in Western music, Western classical music, great composers, starting at least in the early Middle Ages, on up through today, have always, in a sense, had the window open between the concert hall and the street. So specifically, starting with Dufay in the Renaissance, on all the way up through Palestrina, you have these mise à l'homme armé. That's mise à l'homme armé. A mass was in the Renaissance the highest form of composition. It was like Beethoven writing a symphony. And what is l'homme armé? L'homme armé was l'homme armé, la 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 da 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 di da di. Beautiful French folk song. And here all these very important composers felt obliged to make this the cantus firmus, the basis of their mass for the Catholic Church over a period of several hundred years. Okay, so example number one. Jump up to Haydn. 104 Symphony, his great masterpiece, London Symphony. It's an Austrian drinking song. Go up to Beethoven. You all know the first movement of the Beethoven Sixth. Folk song again. Bela Bartok. You can't really separate Bela Bartok from the Serbo-Croatian Yugoslavian folk music that he listened to, recorded, notated, studied. And I don't mean just his folk song singings, that's obvious, but I mean in his string quartets, his abstract music. It's impossible to say, well, this is a folk song, and they're just part of him. He becomes at one with this music. Igor Stravinsky told a few fibs, for political reasons, but really the truth is, if you look at Petrushka and The Rite of Spring and The Firebird, it's filled, much to Stravinsky's credit, with Russian folk songs, which he heard as a young man, of course. In my country, Charles Ives. Charles Ives was an organist. He played organ in a church. And the tunes that he played were kind of like the popular songs of those days. And if you listen to Three Places in New England and other masterpieces of Charles Ives, you will hear these hymn tunes appearing in his works. George Gershwin, is he one of our greatest songwriters or is he one of our greatest composers? He's both. Kurt Weill studied composition with Busoni. He was classically trained. Time came for him to write an opera. He said, well, I don't want an orchestra. I want a banjo. I want trap drums, a saxophone. Well, how about a big diva? Did you know? I know this woman. She can't really sing. Her name is Lotte Lenya, but I think she'll do it. Masterpiece. Three-penny opera. It is the Weimar Republic. And it is on the border between what he heard in the street and what he heard as a composer. And so we have the normal situation in the West is as I've outlined. When I went to music school in the late 1950s and early 1960s, that window between the street and the concert hall had been slammed shut. And I think partly as a result of Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern and their followers, because they didn't, although there are exceptions, I know Pierrot Lunaire, by and large, there was a separation. And this separation continued. Maybe it began to dissolve when Stockhausen's picture appeared on the front of Sgt. Pepper. But this separation began to break down in my own generation. I was born in 1936. And people like Phil Glass and Arvo Pärt and John Adams and Terry Riley were all born in roughly the same period. And here you have a situation where people want to bring in what motivated them to become composers in the first place. What motivated me to become a composer was hearing The Rite of Spring at the age of 14. Shortly after that, hearing the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, and then hearing Bebop, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and the drummer Kenny Clarke. I wanted to be Kenny Clarke. It didn't turn out that way. Kenny Clarke was already Kenny Clarke. But this generation, my generation, felt that they had to bring this back into an atmosphere of, let us say, an old style that was dying. And the old style that was dying is basically German Romanticism. And that's not a criticism of Schoenberg, who was a great composer, or Boulez or Stockhausen. It's simply a fact of the way styles rise, and then they slowly decay, and they're replaced by something else. And it's happened before at the end of the Renaissance, when counterpoint got so complicated that the Baroque period emerged with clear chords and clear harmonies and ability to improvise. And after Johann Sebastian Bach, who brought a style to such perfection, to such greatness, that even his sons knew, Dad has finished this. And they began something much simpler, what we call homophonic music, music with chords and melody, which leads to Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and a whole new style of music, which then goes all the way to Wagner and into Schoenberg and so on. So this is not something new. As a matter of fact, the young composer David Lang, good friend of mine, he's one of the founders of Bang on a Can, once said to me, I envy you when you were born. And what he meant was that I was born at a time when it was necessary and possible to do this. You can't just do this. Hey, kids, let's have a new style of music. That's childish. It's like, hey, kids, let's have a new religion. That's not how human life works. These things happen at a certain time in history when something, as I said, is dying, and people just feel like there's something we've got to clean up. Give me a broom. This place is a mess. And if I wasn't born, and if Pärt wasn't born, and if Riley wasn't born, and if Glass wasn't, somebody would have come along and done that because it needed to be done. And Radio Rewrite is merely one small example of that.
Visto che stiamo parlando di musica, rimaniamo a parlare di musica su questo pezzo di Radio Rewrite. Mi chiedo, cioè mi sembra che la cosa che più l'ha impressionata, l'ha colpita il motivo per cui lei ha scelto queste due canzoni, in particolare dei Radiohead, è per un certo tipo di qualità armonica, per certe caratteristiche dell'armonia di queste due canzoni. E questo ci fa capire quanto per lei, forse non solo per lei, ma per la sua generazione di musicisti americani, aver riportato in primo piano il problema dell'armonia sia stato così importante. Non so se è vero che la qualità armonica di queste due canzoni effettivamente l'aveva colpita.
When I was listening as a student to Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, and then much later to the earlier works of Boulez and Stockhausen, three things are missing. There doesn't seem to be any harmonic center. There doesn't seem to be anything that you could possibly whistle or sing, despite the fact that Schoenberg said in 50 years every postman will be whistling my tunes. It's over 100 years, there's not a postman in sight. And it's not because Schoenberg wasn't a great composer, it's because he had a strange delusion about what he was doing. And you couldn't tap your foot. There was no perceptible rhythm. Now, if you remove from any music, Western or non-Western, any sense of what Stravinsky called the polar attraction of sound. I'm not talking necessarily about the 5/1 cadence and the basis of Western, but some way of there being a harmonic attraction in the music. If you remove that, and you remove any kind of music, any kind of rhythm that you can find periodic that you can relate to, then you have, in a sense, thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And you're in, it's not just making something new, it's taking out essentials. The harmonic series appears in nature. The intervals of the octave and the fifth appear in every music all over the planet. What you say is certainly true, but it's only part of the picture. In other words, not only was harmony disregarded, rhythm was disregarded. And it was to these missing basics that I and others in my generation returned to. To answer this particular, these two tunes, there were two tunes. One of them is called Everything in Its Right Place from Kid A. Some of the younger people here may know that. It's the most complicated three-chord rock around, right? And what got me about the tune is that I don't know if Johnny Greenwood really wrote it, but I saw a video of him singing at the piano. He was completely into it. Everything, da, 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 1, 5, 1. Now, everything in Western music can be reduced, in a sense, to 1, 5, 1. Every Beethoven symphony, if you wanted to say, well, what's the nitty gritty, the very, very basic? Well, it's the dominant going to the tonic, and then we have all the other subdivisions of that this guy would, I'm sure, totally, intuitively throw off this line. Everything just struck me as so, wow, man, you just you hit it on the head. That I use that phrase, that melodic phrase, and I try to actually, their harmony is so powerful in that tune that I try to reverse the order of the chords. The other tune, Jigsaw Falling Into Place, it was the harmony, which you hear at the very beginning of my piece, somewhat elaborated, which pops up either clearly or not so clearly in the, if you heard the whole piece, it's fast, slow, fast, which is jigsaw, everything, jigsaw, everything, jigsaw. And in the jigsaw sections, that harmony is either obvious or not so obvious. But yes, I think a lot of musicians in my generation and in generations that followed, some of them have picked up classic passacaglia lines, the descending scale lines that appear throughout the early Baroque and before. And revitalized them, brought them back. So I think that what we did, it's not a revolution, it's a restoration. And I would say a restoration of harmony and rhythm in a new way.
Ecco, restaurazione del ritmo e dell'armonia in una maniera nuova. mi sembra un concetto interessante ancora da approfondire un pochettino, perché in effetti nella musica di Steve Reich, non soltanto in questo pezzo ma anche nella tutta la sua musica precedente, si vede come diciamo, l'abilità compositiva di Steve Reich riesce a dare una nuova freschezza a un vocabolario armonico che è molto semplice. Non è un vocabolario armonico complesso, non si cercano, come dire, delle sovrapposizioni armoniche, dei contrappunti armonici particolarmente complicati. Spesso si lavora su tonalità abbastanza semplici, dominante, sottodominante, insomma, cose di questo genere, però riescono a essere recuperati in una maniera fresca e completamente nuova. Questo è l'aspetto geniale della musica di Steve Reich, e questo mi fa venire in mente quello che lui mi ha detto anche prima mentre stavamo parlando a proposito di Kenny Clarke, che è stato questo grande batterista, che non è stato il più grande virtuoso della storia del jazz. Cioè Max Roach, Art Blakey erano sicuramente batteristi capaci di fare cose molto più esplosive, molto più complicate dal punto di vista tecnico, ma però Kenny Clarke aveva una qualità particolare per cui anche le cose semplici, il vocabolario ritmico abbastanza semplice e ridotto che lui possedeva, riusciva subito a darti l'impressione immediata dell'originalità della sua musica e dicevi subito: senti questo batterista, senti Kenny Clarke. Non so se questo può essere accettato da Steve Reich.
I think this is exaggerated. Harmonically, if you listen to the desert music from 1983 or 84, or sextet which followed, you'll find a much more chromatic harmony. If you listen to the beginning of Daniel Variation, you'll hear a chord that's really very, very dissonant. I played you a piece which is very, very consonant, and I love it, but it isn't the only thing that I've ever done. I have used chromatic harmony in a number of pieces. Kenny Clarke. I was 14 years old, and I had never heard any music before Haydn and no music after Wagner. So hearing Bach was a complete revelation. Hearing Stravinsky was a complete revelation, and hearing bebop was a complete revelation. I'd heard, popular music of the day. And yes, there were two main bebop drummers, Max Roach, great drummer, and Kenny Clarke, who was another great drummer. And the difference between them was that Max Roach was a more virtuosic player, could do more things, and Kenny Clarke had a magic quality of time. I also explained to you that Kenny Clarke was also a great innovator, which I didn't even know, but one of my percussionists in my own ensemble, Russell Hartenberger by name, was doing some research into this guy Kenny Clarke. Turns out that in jazz drumming, before Kenny Clarke, that means in the 1930s, most jazz drummers played like this. And they keep time on the hi-hat. And they throw in accents on their snare drum with the right. But this is kind of a tied up. And Kenny Clarke felt, and as a result, he put his right hand on the ride cymbal, and he invented, for those of you, anybody here play jazz drums? Is that a one?
No. I know uno, sì.
Well, how many have heard jazz drummers? Nobody? Come on. All right, thank you. And they would play ding, 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 ding. Well, when I started studying drums in the 1950s, I thought that pattern fell down, from heaven. It was just, that's the way you played the ride cymbal. But it didn't fall down from heaven. Kenny Clarke invented it. And so it's not a surprise that he played it with this floating, it's as if the entire band rode effortlessly on this buoyant time. And that struck me as a great gift that he had, which he could then support others with. I don't know if any of my pieces have it, but I think it floats over some of the early pieces like drumming, and maybe in another sense the constant pulse of music for 18 musicians. I rarely think about Kenny Clarke. I do have in my car Walkin' by Miles Davis, which is Kenny Clarke and Horace Silver and Percy Heath, which is, it's a rhythm section. and that's a very classic recording. But outside of that, it's something which really belongs to my early teens, and it certainly was formative. And he's certainly a great drummer.
Tornando un passettino indietro, a proposito di manipolatori del materiale musicale, in particolare di manipolatori del materiale musicale popolare, ce n'è un altro di nome, oltre a quelli che ha fatto prima Steve Reich, che non può essere dimenticato, è quello di Luciano Berio, naturalmente, che è stato anche uno degli insegnanti di Steve Reich in California al Mills College, quando lui studiava negli anni 60, insomma, con Luciano Berio. Allora questo mi offre, come dire, la possibilità di chiedergli qualche cosa, insomma, su questo rapporto con Berio. Cioè, in qualche modo Berio ha incoraggiato anche a usare in maniera così libera la musica, Steve Reich?
Indirectly, yes. I mentioned to you earlier, I first heard Luciano Berio in New York City while I was a student at the Juilliard School. And Berio gave a concert downtown at the New School. And the major piece in the program was a piece of his called Circles by Luciano Berio. Okay. And it's a setting of the poet E.E. Cummings. And the first word is stinging, like a bee stings. And the way that Berio did it was he was then married to Kathy Barbarian, the great singer who was his first wife, and she sang sting, and as she's holding out the s, he's got a percussionist with sandpaper blocks, rubbing them together, and I'm thinking, wow, he's imitating the sound of her consonant with a percussion instrument. Thank you very much. I was getting a lesson right away, and I wasn't even a student. I left Juilliard in '61. I went out to the West Coast. He was at Mills College, and I worked with him from, I guess, 61 or 62 to 63, 61 to 63. And he was at that time working on a piece called Omaggio a Joyce, as in James Joyce. And he was taking Finnegan's Wake, which no one can even read, and he'd have Kathy the Barbarian read parts of it, and then he'd cut it up. This is the days of tape, you know. Anybody remember tape, you know, that you could actually cut up, you know? It was a plastic tape, and he would make this very abstract kind of all these phonemes put together out of her readings. And he also, as I mentioned to you earlier, as a teacher, said to us as a class, he said, okay, I'm going to play 2 recordings of Karlheinz Stockhausen for you. Okay, first one is called Electronic Studies. Okay. Second one is called Gesang der Jünglinge. Gesang der Jünglinge. Why? Because it's a kid's voice. And right away my ear went, the voice is attracting my ear. And basically what I think that I got from Berio, though the way I used it sounds very, very far from what Berio himself did, was the idea that if I'm going to make electronic music, I don't want to use electronic sounds. I want to use sounds from this world, and particularly humans' speech. And indeed, if any of you know It's Gonna Rain, oh, good, come out. All right, hey, I'm batting a little bit anyway. This proved to be very fruitful, and it went on years later into pieces like Different Trains, where I take the human speaking voice and combine it with musical instruments. And this led to The Cave and Three Tales, which is my contribution to opera. It's not an opera, it's music theater, but whereby videotape interviews done by Beryl Korat, the great video artist whose work is on view at the Tate Modern as we speak, are being projected on 5 different screens, and a whole ensemble of musicians, woodwinds, percussion, strings, keyboards, are playing their speech, melody. Sometimes when we speak, we almost sing. When the kids' larynxes aren't too developed. So I was in England, a guy played me a tape, his kid said, "Daddy, I want an ice cream." And it was so perfectly melodic that he could have made a piece, he didn't. But speech melody is something that's a human reality. Janáček, who has nothing to do with our story so far, I was at giving a little talk at the Juilliard School of Music shortly after I wrote Different Trains, which uses speech melody. And there was an elderly European gentleman, obviously an elderly faculty person that I did not know, and he raised his hand, and after I played the piece, he said, "Do you know the writings of Leos Janáček?" And I said, "No, I'm terribly sorry, I don't." He said, "Well, you should." So I thought, this man is telling me something. And I went home and I bought the book. It's called The Uncollected Writings of Leos Janáček. And one of the articles is all about speech melody. And he says some beautiful things. He says the speech melody is like the water lily on top of the water, and its roots go down right into the human soul. I mean, that's a beautiful and true thought. I mean, think of a recording of your voice and a photo of you. Which is more real? Who's to say? So Janáček used to walk around Prague with a music notebook, writing down not what people sang, what they said, their speech melodies. And then these speech melodies would appear in his operas. He even transcribed a train conductor remember in Czechoslovakia, when there was a Czechoslovakia, in those days, this is the 20s and 30s, every educated person had to learn German. And Janáček, being a nationalist, hated that. And he compared the way this train conductor announced the station, first in German with a major seventh, and then how he said it in this beautiful broken triad in Czech. And so the idea of transcribing the way people speak and seeing that as part of the music. Why is it here in Italy, in your country? Opera. Of course opera is going to come from a language like that. And why is rock and roll going to come from English or German? Because languages really do contribute to the musicality of the composers who write them. It's just in our guts.
And what about Wagner?
Wagner was a German.
Stiamo un pezzettino alla volta, stiamo rimettendo un po' insieme tutti i pezzi, insomma, no? del mondo musicale da cui proviene Steve Reich. Ce ne sono alcuni dei pezzi che però ancora mancano, ce n'è almeno uno che mi sembra piuttosto importante ed è il nome di John Coltrane. John Coltrane, possiamo mettere forse una triade, Bach, John Coltrane, Stravinsky, forse può essere questa la triade per capire, insomma, no, quali sono le radici della musica di Steve Reich. Perché John Coltrane? Il Coltrane naturalmente quello diciamo dell'ultima fase dei primi anni 60, naturalmente, non il Coltrane che faceva il bebop. Il John Coltrane che riusciva a creare delle strutture musicali di incredibile pienezza, magari rimanendo ancorato per una quantità di tempo che ai jazzisti allora sembrava inverosimile su un singolo accordo. Poteva improvvisare per un quarto d'ora, per 20 minuti su un accordo di Mi maggiore, lui e i suoi musicisti naturalmente. E questa era una cosa assolutamente impressionante e rivoluzionaria. Io non so se questo tipo di approccio musicale che Steve Reich ha potuto ascoltare con John Coltrane abbia in qualche modo influenzato la sua tecnica che si stava sviluppando poi in quegli anni, nella seconda metà degli anni 60, cioè il phasing, cioè questa capacità di rendere sempre più complesso il linguaggio ritmico, rimanendo fermi, diciamo abbastanza fermi dal punto di vista armonico, cioè dando l'impressione di una staticità che diventava allo stesso tempo una enorme complessità ritmica grazie al fatto che diciamo, le strutture ritmiche andavano lentissimamente sfasandosi un poco alla volta e quindi creando, come dire, dei contrappunti ritmici assolutamente imprevedibili nella musica occidentale, incalcolabili per meglio dire nella musica occidentale che ha una derivazione prettamente matematica, quindi con una serie di divisibilità.
You left out two important names. One of them is Bela Bartok, from whom I got an enormous amount, and the other is Perotinus, from the 11th or 12th century in Paris, the School of Notre Dame. And we'll just let that hang. You all run to your music dictionaries if you don't know who that is. And if you're lucky, get a hold of a recording on ECM made by Paul Hillier of the four-part Organa of Perotin. And if that doesn't give you a boost, too bad. So, John Coltrane. John Coltrane had an enormous influence on me. You're absolutely right. I first started listening to John Coltrane while I was at Juilliard about 1960-61. And then when I moved out to the West Coast, I started to hear him regularly. Berio during the day, Coltrane during the night. Not a bad way to spend your life. And must have heard him at least 50 times in San Francisco. Heard him play with Eric Dolphy. Now, the piece that you're referring to, that I always refer to, is anybody here familiar with a recording called Africa Brass? Hands, class, come on, get them up. Okay, there's a few people. What's significant about Africa Brass is it's about 16, 17 minutes long, and it's all on E, the low E of the double bass. So you know how jazz musicians talk to each other. Hey, man, what's the changes? What's the changes to Africa Brass? E. No. What's the changes? E. E for 16 minutes? Now, that sounds like, a one-way ticket to boredom. I mean, thank you very much. I got to leave now. So how does he make it work? Well, first of all, he was working with Eric Dolphy, who was a brilliant alto sax player, and who introduced the bass clarinet into jazz, and from whom I stole the idea of using the bass clarinet in music for 18 musicians. So those wonderful froggy sounds that are in music for 18 musicians are a direct steal from Eric Dolphy. What Dolphy did for Coltrane, since Africa Brass does have a large brass section, is he wrote glissandos for the French horn, which sound like whoop, whoop, whoop. Sounds like elephants coming through the jungle. So as the piece begins, and you've got this like cacophony of like very clear harmony and complete, insanity going on in the French horns. So timbral variety. Then Coltrane himself, he's playing mostly soprano saxophone, and sometimes he's playing just gorgeous melodic material, and sometimes he's just screaming through the instrument, pure noise. And number three, in terms of rhythm, he has Elvin Jones, the drummer. Elvin Jones was probably the most polyrhythmic, most complicated drummer to play jazz, or he's certainly a candidate for that. And so I'm not sure, were there two drummers on Africa Brass? Or maybe it's just Elvin Jones sounding like two drummers. So if you put together timbral variety, rhythmic complexity, melodic invention, then you can stay rooted on E, and it's E minor, for 16, 17 minutes, and be riveted, because what you're not getting harmonically, you are getting from all these other musical factors, and they are highlighted and accentuated by the fact that the harmony is relatively static. And it is completely static. It's constantly changing its voicings and so on and so forth. So this was a kind of object lesson that was in the air in the 1960s. You all know the Beatles were listening to Indian music, and they weren't the only ones. Phil Glass was listening to Indian music. Terry Riley was listening to Indian music. I was very interested in West African drumming. I went to Ghana and studied drumming there. I went to study Balinese gamelan playing, two different kinds of gamelan, on the West Coast in the United States in the summers of 1973 and 74. In Motown rock, in that period there was a guy by the name of Junior Walker, and he released a single called Shotgun. And what was distinctive about Shotgun was that the bass line went bum, ba-dee-da-ba-ba-dum, ba-dee-da-ba-ba-dum. You're waiting for the change. There isn't any change. Ba-da-da-ba-ba-dum. The whole side of a record. Usually, every pop tune is ABA. You get the release, and you go back. No, just this repeating bass line. So here you have music coming in from non-Western sources, recorded on the None Such label, which I'm signed with, and many other labels. You have live musicians like Ravi Shankar touring around playing. You have recordings of Balinese music, West African music, other forms of Indian music from the south and north, Japanese gagaku, on and on and on. Pop sources, rock in Motown. Harmonic stasis is in the air. So if musicians who have their headphones on and have their antenna up and are listening to the same stations, they are going to receive these signals and they're going to start thinking about these sources, which are so different, so diametrically opposed to the Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, Boulez, Stockhausen, and even Berio. Also, Berio was a very flexible case, and we'll have to put him in a special compartment. So, yes, John Coltrane was part of a harmonic reality that was happening, particularly in America, and that may be why the kind of music that is, quote, called minimalism arose in America at that time.
Cosa? Sì, alle domande adesso. Sì. No, ci sarebbero tantissime altre cose naturalmente che sarebbe bello chiedere a Steve Reich, però non vorrei monopolizzare questa conversazione, quindi ben volentieri se c'è nel pubblico qualche persona che vuole fare delle domande, c'è un signore laggiù per esempio.
Volevo sapere come mai il maestro Reich avesse scelto Pat Metheny per suonare Electric Counterpoint, è una mia curiosità personale. Grazie.
It's like this. I was asked by various classical guitar players, gee, my music would sound good on guitar. Have you considered writing something? So I was talking to Bob Hurwitz, who used to run ECM records before he took over None Such, and Pat Metheny and I were both recording for ECM. So Bob Hurwitz said to me, well, what do you think? Do you think Pat Metheny would play it? I said, I have no idea. He said, well, wait a minute, I'll call him up. So 5 minutes later, I was talking to Pat Metheny. And Metheny turns out to be just a lovely, open, friendly, credible musician. And we got together. I said, look, Pat, all I know is, EADGB, And he said, after we spoke, he said, write single lines. So I only have a few simple triads at the latter part of the piece. And that was basically it. And the piece was written, I think, having heard him and trying to write something almost intuitively that just felt Pat Metheny-ish when you're writing for somebody like that. Okay?
Io volevo fare una domanda a proposito del triplo quartetto che sarà eseguito anche stasera. Volevo chiedere al signor Reich da dove prende in prestito quest'idea del doppio e poi del triplo quartetto, sapendo che già nel Cinquecento qui nell'area veneziana iniziavano gli esperimenti per doppio coro e poi siamo arrivati fino al romanticismo con i pezzi per 2 o 3 orchestre, quindi volevo chiedere appunto se la sua è una semplice esigenza di compattezza contrappuntistica oppure se prende in prestito da una qualche cultura della storia della musica.
The string quartet has a problem. Where's the other viola? Where's the other cello? All I got is 2 fiddles. Now, I am always writing unison canons from It's Gonna Rain till today. So I have to have instruments of the same timbre locking with each other. So if I don't find it in one string quartet, how about if I have two? Or how about even better if I have three? Then I have more possibilities for interlocking of identical instruments, which is what you will certainly hear this evening in triple quartet. It has nothing to do with any historical model. It is a necessity that I found myself loving to write for strings, and knowing that there are string quartets like Kronos who are open to any way of playing, including pre-recording themselves twice, and then usually triple quartet is played with some quartet, it could be Kronos, but there are many other quartets that do it, and then two pre-recordings, either done by Kronos or done by the quartet themselves. And so it's quartet pre-recording. But tonight, you will hear everybody live, and they're great. And so I hope that's the answer.
Volevo ringraziare Reich perché ha messo in relazione la musica col pensiero. Infatti la sua formazione ha fatto degli studi di percussione e di composizione, ma anche di filosofia. Perché questo fa parte della mia domanda. Nella musica c'è, secondo me, un aspetto emozionale, cosa comunichiamo, ma anche un aspetto razionale, come la costruiamo. In che modo questa relazione entra nel suo modo di comporre? La seconda domanda, sarò molto veloce, lei ha fatto molto riferimento alla musica popolare e anche si è ispirato, l'ha citato adesso, alle musiche popolari del Ghana e anche di Bali. Ma non le sembra che anche rispetto all'Ottocento, quando ad esempio i grandi compositori si ispiravano alla musica popolare che poi diventava cosmopolita, oggi ci sia il contrario, che forse la musica popolare sta scomparendo perché non c'è più quella melodia del discorso, tutti parlano inglese, anzi globish, e sta diventando appunto la musica globalizzata, la musica popolare.
Well, to answer your first question, I have used various ways of constructing my own music. A piece like drumming, basically drumming is, that's drumming. Everything else is elaboration of pitch, an instrument and whatnot. That was in 1971. Now, starting in 1976 and continuing on through to today, I sit at the piano with my music notebook and I make up a series of harmonies, and that harmonic underpinning becomes the basis of the music. So things change in that respect. As far as me becoming a composer, what really convinced me that I wanted to become a composer was nothing in the popular field. It was The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, which remained and remains an incredible influence on me from then, when I was 14, to today. And later on, the amount my basic use of canons, my basic use of the modes, comes out of studying Bartok's Simple Microcosmos, volumes 1 and 2, where he uses a great deal of both simple canonic structures and explicit uses of Mixolydian mode, etc. So I have been trained in using these and other great composers as a model. As far as your feeling about contemporary popular music, I can't speak for a universe of different musicians. We do live in a world, and I, as an English speaker, understand that I think the nitty-gritty of all of this business, if you're an airline pilot, you must speak English. In other words, if you're flying a plane and you're responsible for the lives of the people on the plane, every airport on the face of this planet will only listen to you if you speak English, because some language had to be chosen. Now, my guess is, America won World War II, and this was a momentous event, and it probably, together with the United Kingdom, created a situation where instead of the lingua franca, it became English as the universal tongue. And English also found its way, therefore, into other non-English speaking countries, like Daft Punk is a French group, and one that I admire. But their English is great, even if it's going through a vocoder. So I can't answer your question beyond that, and I hope you'll give it a try and forget about the words and just listen to the melodies. I mean, who knows what Bob Dylan was saying in those? I have no idea to this day, but the music's good, so enjoy that.
C'è il presidente Baratta che voleva fare una domanda.
Far from me the temptation to give too much weight to the words with which we identify movements or in whatever field of art. Still, you have mentioned at the end of your speech minimalism. Since we run beyond a festival of music, also a possibly more famous international exhibition of art, in that world, the word minimalism is attributed to a movement which is super abstract. Nothing to do with pop, nothing to do with reality. It's super abstract. Where minimalism there is with very few elements, but the result and the aim is definitely abstract. Therefore, my question, just because you mentioned it, who invented for you the word minimalism, and are you happy with it or not?
Very good question. For president of this institution, you have a presidential question. Well, I have to tell the guilty party is the English composer and musician Michael Nyman. How many people? Michael Nyman? Michael Nyman band? Who was who was and is a good friend of mine. I met Michael Nyman in 1970 on my way to Ghana to get a cheap airline ticket in South London. I posed as a Nigerian Airlines engineer. Now, do I look like a Nigerian Airlines engineer? But nevertheless, I was able to get this ticket that way. And Michael and I hit it off, and he listened to my music for the first time. And he was very struck by it because it was so different from the prevailing Stockhausen Boulez, even Richard Maxwell Davies, etc. So different from what he found difficult himself. And I think he then thought about the visual arts. Saul Lewitt, very good friend of mine, Frank Stella, Carl Andre, other people who were doing minimal art, very reductive, geometric art. And he was listening to what? He was listening to Come Out, It's Gonna Rain, Piano Phase, very early pieces of mine. So Michael, and what you left out of your question, this is an old tradition. When we say Baroque, it's really Baroque architecture comes first, and then it's applied to Baroque music. When we say Impressionism, we think of Monet and Manet and Renoir and who knows, and people say, je ne sais quoi, there's something about Debussy and Ravel and Satie that is somehow like this music. And then we go to Kokoschka and Kirchner and Nolde, and we say, ich weiß nicht, but it's a little bit like Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, and they became expressionists. Same thing with Michael Nyman. He's looking at the visual arts, taking the term exactly as you say, and applying it to music. I think it has a certain validity at that very, very early stage, when I'm doing piano phase and maybe even up to drumming, and Lewitt is doing gray cubes, but Saul married an Italian girl, you know that. And he came to Italy, and all of a sudden we have these beautiful Solowitz and this gorgeous, array of colors coming from a visit to your country, from living in your country. So at that stage of the game, it was a valid thing. But once those connections are made, I could write a Mahler symphony and change one note and say, a new form of minimalism. Because I'm in jail.
Quanto tempo abbiamo ancora? C'è ancora una domanda che posso fare io a lui oppure abbiamo? No, perché c'è ancora una cosa che volevo chiedere a Steve Reich, che forse può anche aiutare a capire magari un po' meglio uno dei pezzi che verranno eseguiti stasera, cioè City Life, perché nel terzo movimento di City Life c'è una parte preregistrata, cioè la speech melody di cui parlava prima Steve Reich naturalmente, una parte che è stata tratta dallo scambio di informazioni che si stavano dando, credo, i vigili del fuoco, non so se o i vigili del fuoco o la polizia.
No? It was a black political rally in front of City Hall.
Ah, ok. Sull'attentato che c'era stato nel 1993 al World Trade Center di New York, perché noi ci dimentichiamo che prima dell'11 settembre c'era già stato un attentato al World Trade Center che aveva fatto 6 morti con un'autobomba. Steve Reich poi ha scritto anche un pezzo dopo per l'11 settembre, un pezzo abbastanza recente per l'11 settembre, e lui è di New York, è nato, cresciuto a New York, anche se adesso da qualche anno se n'è andato, è andato a vivere in campagna un po' fuori, però insomma questa città evidentemente l'ha vissuta, e City Life naturalmente è un grande omaggio anche alla sua città naturalmente. Allora sono curioso di sapere come lui ha vissuto questi 20 anni di New York con queste due immense tragedie che sono stati gli attentati.
Well, you're correct. The last movement of City Life that you'll hear tonight, the voices are the voices from the New York City Fire Department talking to one another about what happened, which was that a bomb was exploded in the parking lot of one of the towers, and the smoke killed about 6 people, but nothing on the scale of what happened later. But of course, it was the same Muslim fundamentalists who did that, and then they returned almost less than 10 years later, in 2001, to finish the job quite successfully. I lived 4 blocks from Ground Zero. And on 9/11, I and my wife were in Vermont, 300 miles north of the city, but my son, my granddaughter, and my daughter-in-law were in our place 4 blocks from Ground Zero. And the phone rang about 8:30 in the morning, and my son said, because our place was 8 stories high and there was a higher building right in front of us, so you couldn't see the World Trade Center because there was a building close to us. He said, I think they bombed the tower again. He could feel it and hear it. So he said, put on the TV. So we put on the TV just as the second plane hit. And it was very clear at that time that this was no accident. It was a perfectly clear day. And it was clear to me that this was the finishing off of the first bombing that had happened in 1993. To make a long story short, my neighbor was a very together guy, had a van where came back. I told my son to close, we had double windows, so no dust or very little could come in, and I said, put a mask. We had these little hardware store masks. Put one on the baby and yourself and your wife, and don't go outside and don't hang up. So we had the phone open for 6 hours, fortunately. And finally, about 4 in the afternoon, my neighbor came home, and he was able to get my son and my daughter-in-law and my granddaughter and his family in this van. And you couldn't go up the west side, you couldn't go up the east side, but if you knew the city, you could get out. And he got up north of the city. We drove down from Vermont, picked my son up and my granddaughter and daughter-in-law, and drove back up to Vermont, where we had to stay for 30 days because once you lived below Chambers Street, the U.S. Army was there, and you could not pass Chambers Street, even if you could prove you lived there. It was just, sorry. Finally, 30 days later, we were able to show identification and go in, and thank God the place was, intact and okay. But it made a huge impression. Some people interviewed me shortly thereafter. They said, are you going to make a piece about 9/11? This is in 2001. And I had just spent several years working with Beryl Card, the video artist I mentioned, who's my wife, on this piece, Three Tales, which was in Torino, I think about 10 years ago. And if I felt I see one more sample, one more piece of electronics, I'm going to get sick. So I said, no, I'm not going to do a piece about it. And instead, for 7 years, I wrote instrumental and vocal music, and that's it. And then I got a call in 2009 from David Harrington from the Kronos Quartet saying, Steve, we'd like you to write a third piece for us, and we want you to use pre-recorded voices. And I said, for you, David, anything. And I hung up the phone, and I had no idea at all. Suddenly, about a month later, the light bulb, I said, wait, I have unfinished business. And then 9/11 clicked into my mind. I was going to play for you today, WTC 9/11, but a number of people thought that it might be a little bit too intense. And so I was advised that since there was a new record and that it was a more upbeat type of record and a more consonant, no chromatic harmony piece, to play Radio Rewrite. But if we meet again, or if you're curious, it's only 15 minutes long. It's very compact, and it is quite different than what you heard today. It's called WTC 9/11. WTC means, as David Lang pointed out to me, three things. World Trade Center, world to come, well-tempered clavier. Thank you very much.